Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. I'm the GM Philosopher and today we are talking about formatting homebrew D&D content easily and managing that content. And this came from a question, a great question from Angus Drummond 6945 and Angus Drummond, I'm going to call you Angus for short. I just want to give you a shout out, say thank you for this awesome question, and I'm going to read this. I would love your input on something. How do you best format your homebrew content? With aforementioned homemade RPG system, I'm looking to format the races, the lore, the game rules in a simple foundation, but I don't want it to be as reading heavy as the player handbook. For example, what are some tips or pointers that you'd have for this? Really appreciating your thoughts on your videos. I hope you're doing well. Hey, thank you so much, Angus. So there's a lot to unpack here. Creating a homebrew system is no walk in the park. It sounds like Angus is already rolling with a homebrew RPG system, homemade system. Now, I have some experience with this, and I'm going to use my experience to basically give you these things. In this video, you're going to find 4 principles that I have found extremely useful for helping me to guide not only the creation, but the management and also the presentation of homebrew materials. You're also going to find my 4 tips that I would use based on those principles to help you effectively manage and present your content to your players. And then I have a final tip that really is going to bring it all together. It's going to be basically tip number 5, final tip. You're going to want to stick around for that one because I think that once you hear these principles and you hear my other 4 tips, this final tip is going to really help you to formulate the very best answer for your game and managing your homebrew stuff. So with that being said, let's jump right into this. Now, the first principle: decide if you want to make your homebrew content a mystery or open source. This is actually really important, and this is important regardless of whether it's completely homebrew or you're just putting homebrew elements on an existing system. In other words, when you have homebrew game mechanics, homebrew class, level up features, homebrew race, stats, etc., do you really want or need to provide all this stuff to your players, or can it stay a mystery until it's needed? Now, this is important to point out because there are some types of gamers who want to know exactly what they're dealing with. Min-maxers and power gamers are the most apt examples. They will pour through entire books, spend a lot of time creating the most optimized character possible. So for these types of gamers, you're going to have a really hard time selling the mystery thing. If you just give them, well, here's what you have right now. Oh, but I want to optimize my character. I want to know what I should take so in the future I have a better optimization. And if you are not going to go to the lengths to provide like all of that data to them, they're probably not going to be very happy about it. I've just noticed that this is a specific type of gamer who deals with this. So understanding whether to make your homebrew content a mystery as players level up or discover, they learn more, versus you kind of provide them with all the rules up front and let them make decisions about their characters like in advance. Those are kind of 2 different decisions. Obviously, going with the mystery one is going to be less work, but the open source one is going to appeal to a wider spectrum of gamers. So that's the first principle you really want to think about when you're doing this. Second principle: decide if your homebrew content is going to stand alone or utilize parts or most of another system. So for example, are you creating homebrew like supplemental material for Dungeons and Dragons, or is your entire system homebrew, or is it some, meshing of the 2? The more you use an existing system as a baseline foundation and then you supplement with like homebrew content, the less work it's going to be and the easier it will be to integrate players into your homebrew stuff. Don't forget, it takes a long time for someone to learn a game system. Brand new D&D players, for example, it might take them quite a while to understand the rules and figure things out. And with a homebrew system, it's really not much different, except for you have to remember that with a homebrew system, you generally don't have entire books with the rules that players can read between sessions. And hence the whole question. And I think that that's what Angus was getting at, is what is the best way to do this without making it so like paper heavy, like a whole player handbook that players have to read through. And so for this, I would say it's probably better to either go super simple and then go the mystery route as opposed to complex and open source, or use an existing system as a foundation and make homebrew elements to put into that system. Now, with that being said, it is completely possible to make your homebrew system very simple And in fact, I think you should be. And we're going to get into that here in a minute. But I want to move on to the fourth principle here. Understand that game mechanics matter more to some types of gamers than they do to others. I've kind of already said this, but like, there are going to be some gamers who might actually be high key frustrated with a homebrew system. Part of the reason is because homebrew systems haven't gone through, hours and hours and hours of playtesting, generally speaking, to iron out the kinks. And if you have like min-maxers or power gamers or even rules lawyers at your table, they might look at your rules and get frustrated if they don't feel consistent or feel scalable, if they don't seem to scale properly, or if it seems like there's too many loopholes. This might really frustrate players even more. Like that might frustrate them even more than keeping all of the data a mystery. So, there is definitely an element of know your group to this. There are going to be some gamers who are going to sit down and they're not going to care what system. They're just going to be like, oh, hey, I want to make a character. Let's start playing. Can I have a black cape? Can my character carry a sword? Like these are the types of players, types of gamers who are going to be way more friendly with, a homebrew thing, especially if it's in development than, power gamers and the like. Those who are focused more on role play, the mechanics are going to tend to be more of probably the crew you're going to want to roll with for homebrew content, in my experience, unless you have really fleshed it out, play tested it, and kind of understand how it's going to go. With that being said, I'm going to now move into my 4 tips regarding this. So these 4 principles are basically designed to help you like kind of get the juices going. Now we're going to talk about these 4 tips. By the way, give me a thumbs up and a subscribe. If you are so far enjoying this video, I really appreciate it. I rely on thumbs up and subscribes to grow my channel. And if everyone who watches gives me a thumbs up or a subscribe and drops a comment, which I would also love for you to drop a comment, let me know what you think about this stuff. If everyone did that, my channel would grow so much faster. And I would just thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That is how my community can give back to me if they enjoy my content. So I just really appreciate that. Now, let's move into these tips. Tip number 1. Only create what you need and supply it in the simplest manner possible. If you can fit your mechanics onto 1 or 2 or 3 pages and keep it so simple that you can print them out and share them with your players, that is going to help you so much more than trying to fill a whole book. And so I think the answer, Angus's question here, which I'm going to return to this just for a minute. With my aforementioned homemade RPG system, I'm looking to format the races, the lore, the game rules in a simple foundation, but I don't want it to be as reading heavy as the player's handbook. Okay, so if you don't want to fill a whole book, the only answer is that you have to make it simple, which means you're going to have to probably cut out all needless stuff. Now, you don't have to think of it as cutting out needless stuff. What you could think of it as cutting out anything that isn't needed for the foundation and we can add later. This is totally fine on a case-by-case basis. You could also say cut out everything, leave room for player creativity, right? And then we can create that stuff as we go. Or maybe I even have it created in my mind, but we don't need to get into it until it becomes an issue. So for example, having very simple base player creation rules, not allowing for any races, but then saying to your characters or your players, what kind of characters do you want to create? Let's create homebrew races. Everyone create their own homebrew race, right? And then when they do that, you all homebrew the mechanics of those races. Those rules are going to be way more flexible and way less rules heavy than if you try to make a list of races with all of the stuff included. The downside to this is that the game can spiral wildly out of control in power levels if characters kind of get the drop on you and give their races some stuff that you didn't realize would be unbalanced. I personally do not worry about this, and I'm not afraid of this. Generally speaking, I tend to create first, check for scalability or balance later, do what we have to do to make it balanced. It's all good. I want players to play the characters they want to play, and then I just do what I have to do to keep them from breaking the game. But some GMs are not as comfortable with that concept. So that's the tip. Keep it simple. Tip number 2, do not be afraid to keep things mysterious or to limit options. Just note that power gamers and min-maxers will likely hate this approach. For example, you could have a whole list of the weapons that are available in your campaign, your players. You don't have to give them that list, though. In fact, you don't even have to create that list until they find the weapons. For example, your characters start out, what kind of weapon would your character start with? I want a samurai sword. I want a katana. Okay, here's a katana. Here's the stats for it. Okay, what other weapons are available in the world? It's like you'll know when you find them. And when you do, I'll give you the stats for them. So see, this is kind of like a way to really manage and only create what you need to create, which will help limit overwhelm. The problem with it is that if you do create it ahead of time, you just need to make sure that it's in a format that you can deliver to your characters. Or if you don't create it ahead of time, that's okay too. You just have to know you're going to be doing a lot of off the cuff riffing to create these things as you go. Personally, I like that approach when I'm doing homebrew, but it's because I love to riff and go off the fly. Okay, now tip number 3. For formatting content for races and classes, I favor super simple concepts and collections of data that can be shared on single page formats, something approximating a 1-page sheet that'll equip the character with what they need. I usually favor Google Docs for this, and I like to print these out for the players. Okay, so this is just straight up. If my players are sitting down to play my homebrew game, which I have actually a whole homebrew system that I created. We used to play homebrew Star Wars. I created it for Star Wars, could be used to do anything, but it involves a lot of player creating stuff and me giving them stats for that. That's really the whole mechanic. It's roll D100s against my mental DC checks, factor in skills that you have, which are player created, factor in racial traits, which are player created, factor in weapon stuff, which is stuff I create, factor in magical type stuff that's player created, right? And when I say player created, I mean the player says what they want. Me and them work together to come up with some stats that I feel are balanced, that they feel represents their character. So when I'm doing homebrew, the players are doing most of the creative heavy lifting as it pertains to their characters, abilities, skills, etc., even lore, and I'm filling in the rest and basically presenting them with stuff as they come across it, right? And I like to deliver this stuff in single page documents. To me, if you can't fit it on a single page, it's just probably too complicated for a homebrew, for a complete homebrew that's not relying on some kind of like deep foundational principle. Because the principle of my homebrew game is very, very simple. Like when I haven't run it in a long time, but when I've run a bunch of games with my own homebrew system, which is basically a very detached version of classic Marvel. It's like every check just consists of you rolling percentiles. I have a DC check in my head. You either succeed or you fail, and there are varying degrees of success and failure, and that's it. That's what it is, and every check is just in my brain before you make it, and boom, we see what the result is. It's very storyline driven. There are not even damage dice. It's just I think about how much damage I think it did, boom, and away we go. And the players track their HP with percentage. So they have 100% HP versus 50% HP. And then whenever they get hit with an attack, I roll something that I think approximates, a fair calculation of what I think the damage would be. And that's all the core mechanics. That's all the core mechanics. I can fit that all on one piece of paper. Every player can have that. Everything else that's built for the whole game is either lore created by me, stuff created by me, or stuff the players create for their characters. And then we write it down, I print it out, and I give it to them. But they pretty much created it. They just checked it with me to make sure it's balanced. So that's kind of how I approach it, right? Some players don't like this. For some players, that's too much creativity. Some players like to have options. So I'll give them options. I'm totally fine to do that. But I'm just kind of saying that's kind of the format, the default format. If a character doesn't want to come up with their own thing, I'll say, would you like me to come up with something for you? And then they'll be like, yeah. So I'll create something for them. But same thing, fit it on one piece of paper, give it to them, right? Okay. Tip number 4. For world lore, always start with what needs to be known and build on it over time. I find this best to do in Google Docs as well. For my latest campaign, I homebrewed the whole world. This is very common for me. I almost never play in published worlds. I did play a big long-term game in Greyhawk at one point, but I almost always create homebrew worlds. And when I do this, it's always the same thing. I start with like probably a 2-page synopsis of the campaign basis, like what the campaign is about. And then I start with like 12-ish pages of world lore that I work on for about 2 weeks leading up to the campaign. I create it, and I have 2 versions of it. I have a version with secret stuff for GM, and I have a version for the players. I just keep them in Google Docs. I give players the Google Doc link of the one that's for the players, and I just keep building on it over time. At this point, my document for player content for the stuff probably has like 60, 70 pages of stuff in it. I just keep adding to it. Players can check it, but really it's just stuff we figure out in game. So a lot of the players don't go looking in there because we kind of just deal with it in game and they discover it and that's what they know, right? So I'm not super worried about that as much. And to be honest, our note taking really tracks kind of what is created. And that's a really good system for that. I have a dedicated note taker at my table who he keeps meticulous notes every session, and in return, he gets an inspiration point every session. And every 3 sessions or so, he gets a magic item in game for performing the service. So it's pretty awesome. And that takes care of a lot of tracking that, but that's for the world and stuff, right? All right. Now, this leads me to my final tip. And this is really, I think, the tip that's most important. And for Angus's question, I think this is the tip that's really going to make the biggest difference when trying to balance homebrew and, what to homebrew and how to organize it. Remember that there's a reason why it takes entire teams, years of work, and a lot of money to develop full-fledged TTRPGs like D&D, because it's actually a lot of work. You can totally homebrew, and I understand that urge to want to homebrew. Every so often, I get into these phases where I start working on my own homebrew, like hardcore system, and I just get excited about it, and I think it's so cool. And I totally understand that urge to want to develop a homebrew system. I totally understand that. Some players are more serious about it than others. My group really loves Dungeons and Dragons, so that's what I stick with. But it's totally possible that in my future, I will be doing some homebrew gaming. And so I totally understand that urge. With that being said, when you think about homebrew, I want you to think about keeping it super simple, not overwhelming yourself, not overwhelming or confusing your players, and allowing for plenty of open-endedness to help you shape your homebrew system or game as you go. Creating a system like Dungeons and Dragons with all of the resources, even just in the player's handbook, is a lot of work. And if you want to simplify it, the only way to simplify is to remove things. But you have to understand that when you remove things, you're going to leave gaps that can only be filled in a certain number of ways. Someone has to create things for that on the fly, or just can't exist in your game. And so as I approach my final conclusion to answer this question, and I know that we've kind of been a long way around talking about this, but really it comes down to this. How much work do you want to put into it? How much are you willing to put into it? And how much are you willing to kind of leave open-ended and craft on the fly? I think that these things are probably the most important questions for you to ask yourself, and they kind of dictate how you want to do this. Sharing the lore, it has to be on some kind of document. Google Docs is free, and you can share links to it, and you can print it out. And so this is awesome. To me, as far as just like a material format, that is really the big winner. You can even format it in chapters and with page jumps and whatnot. But I think that it's really important to understand that you can quickly overwhelm yourself with homebrew stuff, and you can overwhelm your players if you try to give them too much. I one time had a homebrew GM, like a GM who was running a complete homebrew system, and it was actually like a cyberpunk type system, but they actually created all the rules by themselves, and they did actually a really good job. They had it was like a 40-page player handbook they created, and it had a whole bunch of things in it, and it was actually super cool. However, I did find myself kind of overwhelmed. Like, there's an element of I just kind of didn't have time to read through the whole 40-page book and meticulously craft my character, especially considering that I didn't even see the book until I think it was just like a day or two before our first session. So, when I got in there to create my character, I basically just did as fast as I could. I was just like, I want to play this kind of character. Okay, I'll pick this. I'll pick this. I'll pick this. I really didn't try to optimize at all. I just picked the coolest thing I saw and did it. And I had a lot of fun doing that. But I still don't know. Probably I care a lot about playing role-playing games. I care a lot about it. But to this day, I probably only know about 7% of what he worked on and wrote and put in that book. But then again, I tend to be a very role-play heavy role player. I tend to care much less about stats. I mean, I don't care if I build a super squishy character who isn't super great at anything if I think it's fun to role play. And not, they might die. I have had a long track record of when I play in my friends' games, my characters die out at a pretty fast rate. And I'm okay with that. I'll just make a new character. Not that I'm just running to oblivion, but I think it's fun to role play. And I'm okay with the risk that a squishy character may get squished. And it's a risk I take. And I try to make it as epic and as story driven as possible. With that being said, I feel like that whole game experience I just kind of articulated would have been better if I would have been given a single sheet to kind of basically give me some parameters and say, okay, here's parameters, but work with the GM to come up with one skill, to come up with a primary magical ability, to decide what 2 weapons you're going to carry, and then what piece of technology you have, right? And then just leave it open-ended and let me brainstorm that. I felt like if I would have been given that, it would have been way more fun, and I would have been able to be super creative, and I could have like riffed with the GM to come up with my stuff, and I could have even typed it out and showed it to him and been like, hey, is this cool? You know, whatever it is. I feel like that would have been for me a much more fun approach. So that's just kind of my 2 cents on the matter. I hope that this video has helped. I realize that this is a big, deep topic, and I realize that probably mostly what I've done in this video is just like tried to stimulate thought about what direction you want to go in. The actual management of this really depends on the answers to these questions. And I hope that these stimulate your mind in such a way to where you can arrive at a place that really works for you and works well for your group. Do not give up on creating homebrew RPG systems. I think that's so much fun and I love it. It's just a matter of how to do it best, how to manage it, and it's a very, very valid line of question and thought. So anyway, there you go. That's all I have for this one. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'm here almost every day, create videos about the best game in the world, D&D. So I will see you, awesome people, on the next one.